The mahogany doors of courtroom 302 swung open, sealing the fate of a 20-year marriage. On one side sat a woman in a faded beige cardigan, her hands trembling quietly in her lap. On the other sat her billionaire husband, smirking, flanked by a $2,000 an hour legal team and a 26-year-old mistress dripping in Cartier diamonds. The mistress laughed, a cruel, echoing sound that bounced off the wood-paneled walls, whispering loud enough for the gallery to hear, "Look at her. She's walking out of here with nothing." But in less than an hour, that laughter would turn into a desperate, breathless sob. A Los Angeles County Superior Court smelled of floor wax, old paper, and stale resentment. Outside, a gloomy Tuesday rain battered the high, arched windows. But inside courtroom 302, the atmosphere was suffocatingly dry. It was the final day of Sterling v. Sterling, a divorce proceeding that the tabloids had largely ignored, mostly because Richard Sterling's PR team had spent a small fortune keeping his name out of the gossip columns. Richard preferred to be known as a tech visionary, the untouchable CEO of OmniStream Solutions, a logistics software empire valued at over $450 million. He did not want to be known as the man who dumped his wife of 20 years for his former executive assistant. Yet there she was, Vanessa Croft, perched in the front row of the gallery, directly behind Richard's legal team. Vanessa was 26, with perfectly blown-out blonde hair, wearing a tailored white Chanel suit that screamed new money. A stark contrast to the solemnity of the courtroom, she carried an oversized Hermes Birkin bag, resting it on the wooden bench beside her, as if it required its own seat. Every time Richard glanced back at her, Vanessa offered a bright, encouraging smile, occasionally touching the heavy diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, a gift Richard had purchased with company funds, hidden under a generic business expense ledger. Across the aisle sat Claire Kensington. She had reverted to her maiden name on all the court filings, a quiet act of defiance that Richard had mocked during mediation. Claire looked exhausted. At 42, the stress of the 3-year legal battle had carved deep lines around her eyes. She wore a simple, outdated navy blue skirt suit and a faded beige cardigan. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, no-nonsense bun. To anyone looking at the two sides of the room, the power dynamic was painfully obvious. Richard was the sun, and Claire was a burned-out satellite finally being kicked out of orbit. She really wore that? Vanessa whispered loudly to her friend, a fellow socialite she had brought along for moral support, or rather to witness her triumph. She looks like a substitute math teacher. No wonder Richard left. Imagine taking that to a gala. Vanessa's laugh trickled through the courtroom. It was a sharp, mocking sound. Claire heard it. She didn't turn around. She merely tightened her grip on the cheap plastic pen in her hand, staring straight ahead at the empty judge's bench. Beside her sat Arthur Pendleton, a 60-something attorney who wore rumpled tweed suits and had a penchant for chewing on the end of his glasses. Arthur wasn't a celebrity divorce lawyer. He operated out of a modest office in Pasadena. Richard's lawyer, the slick and aggressive Gregory Hayes, had practically laughed Arthur out of the room during their first deposition. "Don't let her get to you, Claire," Arthur murmured, his voice a low, gravelly hum. He didn't look up from his disorganized pile of manila folders. "Let them have their fun. Pride comes before a rather steep fall." "I just want this to be over, Arthur," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so tired. He's hidden everything. The offshore accounts, the shell companies. Hayes is going to convince the judge that OmniStream is entirely his." "Let Hayes try," Arthur replied, finally looking up. A strange, sharp glint caught in his pale blue eyes. "Mr. Hayes is playing checkers. He doesn't realize we aren't even playing on the same board." The bailiff barked. "All rise." Judge Mary Carmichael entered the courtroom. Known for her zero-tolerance policy for legal theatrics, Judge Carmichael was a formidable presence. She adjusted her robes, sat down heavily and peered over her reading glasses at the two tables. "Be seated," Judge Carmichael ordered, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "Let's conclude this. We are here for final arguments and the evidentiary hearing regarding the division of assets, specifically the ownership and valuation of OmniStream Solutions. Mr. Hayes, your client, is the petitioner. You may proceed." Gregory Hayes stood up, buttoning his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. He radiated the kind of arrogant confidence that cost $1,000 a minute. He walked over to the podium, placing his iPad down with a crisp thud. "Thank you, Your Honor," Hayes began, projecting his voice so it resonated perfectly. "For the past 3 days we have established a very clear narrative. Richard Sterling is a self-made man. He is the architect, the engine, and the sole visionary behind OmniStream Solutions. He built this company from a mere concept into a $500 million enterprise through relentless 80-hour work weeks, unparalleled business acumen, and his own separate, independent investments." Hayes paused, turning slightly to cast a pitying look toward Claire. "My client has always been generous. He offered Miss Kensington a very fair settlement of $5 million and the house in Galapagos. But she refused. She sits before you today, Your Honor, demanding 50% of a company she had absolutely no hand in creating. During the years OmniStream was taking off, Ms. Kensington was unemployed. She did not attend board meetings. She did not write code. She did not secure venture capital. She stayed home." In the gallery, Vanessa nodded emphatically, whispering to her friend, "Exactly. A total freeloader. Furthermore," Hayes continued, his tone turning sharp, "we have provided financial records proving that the initial seed money for OmniStream Solutions, Incorporated in 2012, came from a personal loan my client secured through his own independent connections, using collateral acquired after the couple had already emotionally separated. Therefore, under California law, while they were legally married, the asset of OmniStream is solely the property of Richard Sterling. Miss Kensington is entitled to her half of the marital home and standard alimony, nothing more." Hayes returned to his seat with a smug expression. Richard leaned over and patted his lawyer on the back. It was a performance designed to crush Claire entirely, to paint her as a greedy opportunist trying to cash in on a brilliant man's hard work. Judge Carmichael made a note on her legal pad. "Mr. Pendleton, your witness. Are you calling Mr. Turning back to the stand, Arthur Pendleton stood up slowly. He brushed a speck of dust off his tweed lapel, picked up a single, shockingly thin manila folder, and ambled toward the center of the room. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to ask Mr. Sterling a few more questions." Richard Sterling strode to the witness stand with the air of a man walking a red carpet. He swore the oath with a practiced, trustworthy smile and settled into the wooden chair, crossing his legs so his expensive Italian leather loafers were visible. He looked completely unbothered. Why wouldn't he be? His legal team had meticulously scrubbed his financial history. They had buried his assets in complex trusts and offshore LLCs. He knew Claire couldn't afford forensic accountants capable of untangling the web he had built over the last decade. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," Arthur began, leaning heavily on the wooden podium. "I want to clarify a few things from Mr. Hayes' brilliant opening statement. You claim you built OmniStream solely through your own efforts, correct?" "That is absolutely correct," Richard said smoothly. "I had the vision. I executed it. And your wife, forgive me, your soon-to-be ex-wife, Claire, what was her role in the year 2012 when the company was founded?" Richard let out a soft, patronizing sigh. "Claire was struggling with her direction. She was at home. I encouraged her to find a passion, a hobby, but she preferred to manage the household, which I appreciated, of course. But she had no involvement in my professional life." "I see," Arthur said, flipping open his thin folder. "You stated earlier that the initial seed money to rent the first server space, hire the first 2 freelance coders, and officially file the LLC was $50,000. Is that correct?" "Yes. It was a lean startup." "And where did that $50,000 come from, Mr. Sterling?" "Just to remind the court, as my lawyer stated, It was a personal loan from a private investor who believed in my vision. A man named Thomas Harding, Richard corrected himself smoothly, maintaining eye contact with the judge. He's unfortunately passed away since then, but the promissory note was submitted into evidence. Arthur nodded slowly, pacing a few steps away from the podium. Yes, the late Mr. Harding. Very convenient. Very tragic. Let's talk about the year 2008, Mr. Parr. Sterling, 4 years before OmniStream. Gregory Hayes stood up immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. The company was founded in 2012. 2008 is entirely outside the scope of this asset valuation. I assure you, Your Honor, it is highly relevant to the origin of the funds, Arthur countered mildly. Judge Carmichael frowned. I'll allow it for now, Mr. Pendleton, but get to the point quickly. Thank you, Your Honor, Arthur said. Mr. Sterling, in 2008, the financial markets crashed. What was your occupation at that time? Richard's jaw tightened infinitesimally. The smooth veneer cracked just a fraction. I was working in real estate development. Things took a downturn. A downturn? Arthur chuckled dryly. Mr. Sterling, according to the bankruptcy filings I have right here, you lost everything. You owed over $2 million to various creditors. Your car was repossessed. You were, for all intents and purposes, completely broke. Correct? In the gallery, Vanessa stopped smiling. She leaned forward, a brow furrowing. Richard had never mentioned a bankruptcy. He had always told her he came from old money that he had brilliantly multiplied. The market was volatile, Richard said defensively. Many successful businessmen faced setbacks during the subprime mortgage crisis. Indeed they did, Arthur agreed. That during that setback, who was paying the rent on your apartment? Who was buying the groceries? Objection? Hayes barked. Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Sterling, Judge Carmichael said, her eyes narrowing at Richard. My wife was working at the time, Richard muttered. She was working as a junior financial analyst, wasn't she? Arthur pressed. Working 60-hour weeks to keep you both afloat while you spent your days networking and brainstorming. She supported the household, yes, Richard snapped. That's what spouses do. But that has nothing to do with OmniStream. Bear with me, Mr. Sterling, Arthur said, pulling a single sheet of paper from his folder. It wasn't a bank statement. It looked like an old, yellowed letter. Let's fast forward back to 2012. You claimed you got a loan from the late Thomas Harding. But isn't it true that in 2012 your credit was still completely ruined from your 2008 bankruptcy? No traditional bank would touch you, and no sane private investor would hand $50,000 to a bankrupt real estate developer wanting to pivot to tech. I told you Thomas believed in me. Richard's voice rose in pitch. Thomas Harding was your drinking buddy, Mr. Sterling, Arthur said, his voice suddenly losing its bumbling grandfatherly tone. It turned sharp as a razor. He was a bartender at a pub in Santa Monica. He didn't have $50,000 to his name, let alone $50,000 to lend you. The courtroom fell dead silent. Even the sound of the rain outside seemed to fade. Gregory Hayes scrambled to his feet. Nice trendu. Your Honor, this is outrageous. Plaintiff's counsel is throwing wild accusations without any evidentiary support. We submitted the promissory note. A note signed by 2 men in a bar, Arthur shot back, finally turning to look directly at Gregory Hayes. Your Honor, I have here the actual wire transfer records from September 14, 2012. The exact day the $50,000 was deposited into Richard Sterling's newly formed OmniStream business account. Arthur walked over to the bailiff and handed him the documents to pass to the judge and to opposing counsel. You'll see, Your Honor, Arthur continued, his voice ringing through the silent room, that the money did not come from an account owned by Thomas Harding. It was wired from a brokerage account at Vanguard. Richard gripped the edges of the witness stand. His knuckles turned white. He stared at Arthur with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. Mr. Pendleton, Judge Carmichael said, looking at the document, her eyebrows raised high. "This Vanguard account. It's not in Mr. Sterling's name." "No, Your Honor, it is not," Arthur said, turning slowly to face the gallery, his eyes locking onto Vanessa Croft, whose smug expression had entirely evaporated, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed mask of confusion. Arthur then turned his gaze back to Richard, who looked as though he was about to be physically sick. "Mr. Sterling," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a theatrical, deadly whisper, "would you be so kind as to read the name of the sole owner of the Vanguard account that funded your entire empire?" The silence in courtroom 302 was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press the oxygen right out of the room. Outside, the steady drum of the Los Angeles rain against the high-arched windows was the only sound. Richard Sterling's impeccably tanned face had drained of all color, leaving him with a sickly, grayish pallor. He stared at the single sheet of paper Arthur Pendleton had placed on the ledge of the witness stand, as if it were a venomous snake uncoiling before him. His jaw worked silently, the muscles ticking beneath his skin, but no words came out. "I can repeat the question, Mr. Sterling," Arthur said, his voice mild, though his pale blue eyes were sharp and unyielding. "Could you please read the name of the sole owner of the Vanguard account that initiated the wire transfer on September 14th, 2012. Gregory Hayes, sensing the ground collapsing beneath his $2,000 loafers, leaped to his feet, knocking his expensive leather chair backward. "Your Honor, I must strenuously object. This is trial by ambush. Plaintiff's counsel has produced a document that was entirely absent from discovery. We have had no time to authenticate this so-called wire transfer record. It is prejudicial and inadmissible." Judge Mary Carmichael peered over her reading glasses, her expression thunderous. She looked at the copy Arthur had handed to the bailiff. "Mr. Pendleton, care to explain why this wasn't in the initial discovery packets?" "I apologize, Your Honor," Arthur said smoothly, not looking the least bit apologetic. "But my client and I only gained access to this specific Vanguard historical ledger 3 days ago. As you know, untangling a decade of Mr. You win. Sterling's carefully constructed shell companies takes time. Furthermore, this document is heavily redacted to protect the privacy of the account holder, showing only the date, the routing number to Mr. B's. Sterling's LLC, the amount, and the account holder's legal name. It is a certified bank record, subpoenaed directly from Vanguard's Fraud and Compliance Division under a separate ongoing inquiry. Hayes's face turned a brilliant shade of crimson. A separate inquiry? What inquiry? "Overruled, Mr. Hayes," Judge Carmichael barked, slamming her hand flat on her desk. "You can review the certification seal yourself. It is a legitimate bank document. Sit down. Your client will answer the question." Hayes slowly sank back into his seat, his eyes darting frantically between Richard and the piece of paper. In the gallery, Vanessa Croft shifted uncomfortably. The smug, radiant confidence she had worn like a shield all morning was cracking. She crossed her arms tightly over her white Chanel jacket, the heavy Cartier diamond bracelet clinking nervously against the wooden pew. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Carmichael prompted, her voice dripping with impatience. "Read the name." Richard swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. He gripped the edges of the witness stand so tightly his knuckles were bone-white. He leaned forward, his voice a hoarse, defeated whisper. "The Kensington Family Revocable Trust." Arthur nodded encouragingly. "And the named primary beneficiary and sole trustee?" Richard closed his eyes. The illusion of the self-made billionaire was shattering in real time, the fragments raining down around him. "Claire Kensington," he rasped. A collective gasp echoed from the sparse gallery, mostly from Vanessa's socialite friend, who slapped a hand over her mouth. Vanessa herself sat frozen, her perfectly glossed lips parted in shock. She stared at the back of Claire's head as if trying to drill a hole through a sensible, tightly wound bun. Claire did not move. She sat perfectly straight in her faded beige cardigan, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the empty space directly in front of her. Only the slightest tremor in her shoulders betrayed the tempest of emotion she was hiding. "So," Arthur began, pacing slowly across the well of the courtroom, his hands clasped behind his back. "Let us ensure the court understands the timeline perfectly. In 2008, you were bankrupt. In 2012, you wanted to start a tech company, but you had the credit score of a ghost. You claimed a bartender named Thomas Harding lent you $50,000. But according to this certified wire transfer, the money came from an account wholly owned and controlled by your wife, Claire." "She didn't tell me," Richard suddenly exploded, his voice echoing sharply. He pointed a trembling finger at Claire. "She lied to me. Thomas handed me a cashier's check. He said he had come into some money. He said he believed in my vision. She went behind my back. She protected your fragile ego, Mr. Sterling." Arthur shot back, his voice rising in volume to meet Richard's, dropping the grandfatherly persona entirely. "You were a broken, depressed man who had just lost millions of dollars of investors' money in a real estate collapse. You were drinking heavily. Your pride wouldn't let you take money from your wife, who was working 60-hour weeks at a junior financial firm just to keep a roof over your head. So she took the entirety of the small inheritance left to her by her late mother. She took $50,000, her completely separate premarital property, and she funneled it through Thomas Harding so you could feel like a self-made man." "Objection!" Hayes shouted. "Testifying, Your Honor." "Sustained," Judge Carmichael said, though her eyes were locked onto Richard with undisguised disgust. "Dial it back, Mr. Pendleton." "My apologies, Your Honor," Arthur said, taking a breath. He turned back to Richard. "Mr. Sterling, isn't it true that because the $50,000 was Claire's premarital property and because it was the sole initial capital used to incorporate OmniStream Solutions, that under California law, Claire Kensington doesn't just own 50% of the marital assets? She technically holds the foundational equity of the entire company." Richard looked like he had been struck by a physical blow. He looked frantically at Gregory Hayes. "Greg, what is he talking about?" Hayes was rapidly flipping through a thick legal pad, his face pale. He knew exactly what Arthur was talking about. If the seed money was Claire's separate property, and Richard had never properly bought her out or established a legal separation of that specific asset, the entire self-made separate property defense he had built over the last 3 days was dead on arrival. "I built it," Richard snarled, his composure completely dissolving. "I wrote the code. I hired the teams. I scaled the logistics. She sat at home. She gave you the tools to build the house, Mr. Sterling," Arthur said softly, lethally. "And now you are trying to evict her from it." The revelation hung in the air, fundamentally altering the gravity of the room. Richard Sterling was no longer the brilliant tech visionary who had generously offered his estranged wife a $5 million parting gift. He was a man who had built an empire on his wife's secret sacrifice and was now attempting to legally execute a massive theft. But Arthur Pendleton was not finished. He returned to his desk and picked up a thicker, much heavier red binder. He dropped it onto the podium with a dull, threatening thud. "Your Honor," Arthur said, adjusting his glasses, "now that we have firmly established the true origin of OmniStream Solutions' founding capital, we must examine how the company's assets have been managed over the last 36 months. Specifically, since Mr. Sterling initiated divorce proceedings and filed for a separation of assets." Gregory Hayes stood up, but his previous bravado was completely gone. He looked like a man standing on the tracks, watching a freight train bear down on him. "Your Honor, I must object to the introduction of any more surprise documents. If Mr. Pendleton is going to submit an entirely new financial forensic report—" "These are not surprise documents, Mr. Hayes," Arthur interrupted calmly. "These are OmniStream's own corporate tax filings and expense ledgers which your firm provided to us during the initial discovery phase. We simply looked at them a little closer. Judge Carmichael waved a hand dismissively at Hayes. "Sit down, Counselor. I want to hear this." Arthur opened the red binder. "Mr. Sterling, you are the CEO of OmniStream, correct?" "Yes," Richard muttered, his eyes glued to the binder. "And as the CEO of a company valued at over $400 million, you have a fiduciary duty to manage the company's funds responsibly, especially since we have just established that your wife holds a significant, if not majority, equitable claim to the company." "Correct. I run the company perfectly," Richard snapped, a desperate edge of defiance creeping back into his voice. "Our quarterly earnings are up 20%. I'm sure they are," Arthur agreed. "Let's turn to page 42 of the corporate expense ledger for the fiscal year 2024. There is a recurring monthly line item under external consulting and marketing. It is a payment made to a vendor named VC Public Relations LLC. Do you recognize this vendor?" In the gallery, Vanessa Croft froze. The color rapidly drained from her face. She dropped her phone into her lap, her hands suddenly shaking violently. Richard swallowed. "Yes, they are a boutique PR firm we use for specialized brand outreach." "Boutique indeed," Arthur noted dryly. "According to the ledger, OmniStream Solutions pays VC Public Relations an average of $45,000 a month. That is over $500,000 a year. Could you tell the court what specific services this firm provides for $500,000? "Brand management," Richard said quickly. "Event planning. Social media strategy." "I see," Arthur said, pulling a sheet of paper from the binder. "I have here the incorporation documents for VC Public Relations, LLC, filed in the state of Delaware 2 years ago. The sole managing member and registered agent of this LLC is a Miss Vanessa Croft." Arthur turned slowly, his eyes fixing on the young woman sitting in the front row. Vanessa shrank back into the wooden pew, looking as though she wished the floor would open up and swallow her Hermes bag and her Chanel suit entirely. "Miss Croft, who is currently sitting right behind you, Mr. Sterling," Arthur continued. "The same Ms. Croft who has accompanied you to this trial. The same Miss Croft who, until 18 months ago, was employed as your executive assistant on a salary of $70,000 a year." "Objection!" Hayes yelled, his voice cracking slightly. "Relevance. My client's personal relationships have no bearing on the corporate valuation." So, but... It has every bearing when he is using corporate funds to finance his personal relationships, Your Honor. Arthur fired back, his voice ringing with authority. "Mr. Sterling has been funneling company money that belongs to the marital estate, money that stems from Claire Kensington's initial investment into a dummy corporation to pay for his mistress's lavish lifestyle." The courtroom erupted. Whispers violently hissed through the gallery. The bailiff stepped forward, his hand resting near his radio. "Order!" Judge Carmichael shouted, striking her gavel twice. The sharp cracks silenced the room instantly. She glared at Richard, her eyes flashing with judicial fury. Mr. Sterling, did you authorize payments of $45,000 a month to a company owned by your romantic partner? She provided real services." Richard stammered, panic finally breaking through his carefully curated facade. Sweat was beading on his forehead, ruining his expensive blowout. "She consulted. She organized galas." "Galas?" Arthur asked, flipping a page. "According to the bank statements associated with VC Public Relations, which we subpoenaed legally, Mr. Fern." Hayes, no need to object. The funds from OmniStream were immediately transferred to personal accounts. They were used to purchase a lease on a penthouse apartment in West Hollywood. They were used at Cartier, Tiffany & Co. and luxury car dealerships. Not a single dollar was spent on corporate event space or marketing materials. Arthur leaned heavily on the podium, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet register that carried to every corner of the room. "You didn't just try to steal your wife's company, Mr. Sterling. You actively embezzled from it. You committed corporate fraud to buy diamond bracelets for a 26-year-old woman, while simultaneously standing in this courtroom trying to force the woman who saved you from bankruptcy to live on alimony and table scraps. Gregory Hayes slowly put his pen down. He stared at his legal pad. He was no longer thinking about how to win the divorce settlement. He was calculating his own firm's liability for unknowingly submitting fraudulent financial documents to a superior court judge. He was a divorce attorney, not a white-collar criminal defense lawyer. He subtly shifted his chair an inch away from Richard. Vanessa Croft suddenly stood up. Her face was chalk white. "I need to go," she whispered loudly. She grabbed her oversized Birkin bag, nearly tripping over her friend's feet in her haste to reach the aisle. "Sit down, Miss Croft," Judge Carmichael commanded. The tone of her voice was absolute zero. "Nobody is leaving this courtroom until I say so. The bailiff will lock the doors." The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the courtroom clicked shut with a sound like a vault ceiling. Vanessa collapsed back onto the wooden bench, burying her face in her hands. The mocking laughter that had echoed through the halls an hour earlier was completely gone, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying reality. Richard Sterling sat frozen in the witness chair. The smug, untouchable CEO was gone. In his place was a terrified, ruined man, staring across the room at the woman he had discarded, finally realizing the absolute magnitude of his mistake. The click of the courtroom doors locking echoed like a gunshot. Vanessa Croft sank back into the hard wooden pew, her manicured hands trembling so violently that her heavy Cartier bracelet clattered against the armrest. The illusion of her glamorous, untouchable life was evaporating into the stale, heavily air-conditioned air of courtroom 302. At the petitioner's table, Gregory Hayes stood up. The slick, arrogant sheen he had worn for 3 days was entirely gone, replaced by the grim, hyper-focused demeanor of a man trying to save his own law license. "Your Honor," Hayes said, his voice stripped of its usual theatrical resonance. "In light of the documents just presented by opposing counsel, I must respectfully request a brief recess to confer with my client. Furthermore, as an officer of the court, I must state for the record that my firm had no prior knowledge of the nature of the VC public relations vendor payments." Judge Mary Carmichael leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly on her desk. She looked at Hayes with a gaze that could cut glass. "Mr. Hayes, you submitted those ledgers into evidence. You vouched for their accuracy during discovery." "Under the presumption that my client provided truthful corporate records, Your Honor," Hayes countered quickly, throwing a furious sidelong glare at Richard. "If my client has utilized corporate entities to obscure personal expenditures or defraud the marital estate, he did so entirely outside the purview of my legal counsel." Richard whipped his head around, staring at his lawyer in betrayal. "Greg, you're supposed to be defending me." "I am defending my firm from suborning perjury, Richard," Hayes hissed under his breath, loud enough for the microphone to catch the edge of his panic. "There will be no recess, Mr. Hayes," Judge Carmichael declared, her gavel resting dangerously close to her hand. "We are in the middle of a cross-examination, and frankly, I am entirely too invested in Mr. Limo Pendleton's line of questioning to pause now. Mr. Pendleton, you may continue, ma." Arthur Pendleton adjusted his glasses, completely unbothered by the chaos he had unleashed. He looked like a kindly grandfather who had just accidentally discovered a hornet's nest, though the sharp, predatory glint in his pale blue eyes suggested he knew exactly where the nest was and had brought a baseball bat specifically to smash it. "Thank you, Your Honor," Arthur said. He turned his attention from Richard, who was sweating profusely in the witness chair, to the gallery. "Your Honor, given that Miss Croft is the sole proprietor of a vendor currently receiving $500,000 annually from the disputed marital asset, I would like to call her to the stand as a hostile witness. Her presence here today is quite convenient." "Objection," Hayes cried automatically, though his heart clearly wasn't in it. Overruled, Judge Carmichael snapped. Bailiff, please escort Miss Croft to the stand. Vanessa looked terrified. She clutched her Hermes Birkin bag to her chest like a bulletproof vest. Her socialite friend had physically edged away from her, creating a clear boundary of plausible deniability. Guided by the bailiff, Vanessa walked on unsteady legs past Claire Kensington. Claire didn't gloat. She simply watched the younger woman with a look of profound, quiet pity. Vanessa took the oath, her voice a high-pitched, reedy whisper. She sat down, refusing to look at Richard. Miss Croft, Arthur began pleasantly, leaning against the podium. Let's talk about VC public relations. You incorporated this LLC 2 years ago, correct? Yes, Vanessa whispered. Please speak into the microphone, Mr. Croft. Yes, she repeated louder, her voice trembling. And prior to incorporating this highly lucrative PR firm, what was your professional background in public relations or corporate marketing? Vanessa swallowed hard. I organized the office holiday parties at OmniStream, and I managed Mr. Sterling's personal calendar. You were his assistant, Arthur clarified. A noble profession, to be sure, but quite a leap to jump from managing a calendar to commanding a $45,000 monthly retainer for a $500 million tech logistics company. Could you describe for the court a typical day at the office for VC public relations? Vanessa looked at Richard. Richard's eyes were wide, silently pleading with her to stick to the script they had rehearsed in their West Hollywood penthouse. But Vanessa wasn't looking at a billionaire anymore. She was looking at a sinking ship, and she had no intention of drowning with him. I don't have an office, Vanessa admitted, her voice cracking. No office, Arthur mused. Do you have employees? No. Do you have other clients? No. Ms. Croft, let me remind you that you are under oath, and perjury carries a sentence of up to 4 years in state prison, Arthur said, his voice suddenly hardening into steel. Did VC Public Relations ever provide a single, legitimate, tangible service to OmniStream Solutions? Tears spilled over Vanessa's heavily muscarded eyelashes, leaving dark tracks down her pale cheeks. No, she sobbed, the dam finally breaking. No, we didn't. Richard told me to do it. He brought me the incorporation paperwork and told me where to sign. He said he needed to lower his taxable corporate income and that he wanted to take care of me. He said Claire was trying to steal his money in the divorce and he needed to hide it. Pandemonium erupted again. Gregory Hayes buried his face in his hands, massaging his temples. He said she was a bloodsucker. Vanessa wailed, pointing a perfectly manicured, shaking finger at Richard. He told me the company was all his. He promised me we would get married as soon as he starved her out. I didn't know the money was hers. I didn't know. You lying, ungrateful little. Richard roared, half rising from his chair at the petitioner's table, before Hayes grabbed his arm and yanked him back down. One more outburst like that, Mr. Sterling, and you will spend the night in a holding cell for contempt. Judge Carmichael bellowed, striking the gavel so hard the sound echoed off the high ceiling. Miss Croft, you are excused. Return to your seat and do not speak another word. Matza. Ma'am. Vanessa practically ran off the stand, collapsing into the pew and burying her face in her hands, her sobs echoing loudly in the tense silence that followed. Arthur Pendleton did not smile. He didn't gloat. He simply walked back to his table, picked up one final manila folder, and approached the center of the room. He looked at Richard, who was now a ruined, hyperventilating mess. Mr. Sterling, Arthur said quietly, we have established that you funded your company with your wife's inheritance. We have established that you systematically defrauded your own company to fund a lavish lifestyle for your mistress, while simultaneously trying poverty to the mediator to avoid paying adequate alimony. But there is one final piece of business we must address. At hope, all full ad. Hold on. Then that's all out of doubt. Richard stared straight ahead, his jaw locked, refusing to make eye contact with Arthur. In your initial settlement offer to my client, Claire Kensington, Arthur continued, his voice ringing with absolute clarity, you graciously offered her $5 million, paid out over 10 years, and full ownership of the primary marital residence in Calabas. You presented this as a generous concession, claiming you were walking away from your home to give her peace. It was generous, Richard muttered through gritted teeth. The house appraises at $6 million. Did appraise at $6 million, yes, Arthur agreed. He opened the folder. A beautiful home, paid off completely in 2018, free and clear. A wonderful, secure asset for a woman you were discarding. Except it isn't free and clear anymore, is it, Mr. Sterling? Gregory Hayes looked up, his eyes widening. What now? The lawyer whispered to himself. 3 months before you filed for divorce, Mr. Sterling, Arthur said, holding up a dense multi-page document stamped by the county clerk. You forged Claire's signature on a power of attorney document. You used that fraudulent document to take out a massive second mortgage against the Calabasas property to the tune of $4.5 million. Claire let out a small, sharp gasp. It was the first sound she had made all morning. She looked at Arthur, completely stunned. Where did that $4.5 million go, Mr. Sterling? Arthur pressed, stepping closer to the petitioner's table. It didn't go into the joint checking account. It didn't go into OmniStream. Richard said nothing. His breathing was shallow and rapid. I'll tell the court where it went, Arthur announced, turning to Judge Carmichael. It was wired in 3 separate tranches to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands registered to a shell company named RC Holdings. Richard and Troft Holdings, I presume. You weren't giving Claire a $6 million asset, Mr. Sterling. You were handing her a $4.5 million debt bomb while you planned to sail off with the extracted equity. Judge Carmichael took off her reading glasses. She rubbed the bridge of her nose, her expression one of utter, profound revulsion. She had presided over hundreds of high-net-worth divorces. She had seen greed, spite, and petty vindictiveness. But the sheer calculated malice of Richard Sterling's actions was in a league of its own. You took her money to build your empire, Arthur summarized, his voice dropping to a powerful, resonant hush. You used her company to fund your infidelity. And finally, you tried to steal the roof over her head, intending to leave her bankrupt and saddled with your debt, just as she had found you in 2008. You are not a visionary, Mr. Sterling. You are a parasite. Objection, Hayes said weakly, out of pure, dying muscle memory. Overruled, Judge Carmichael said instantly. Richard couldn't hold it in anymore. The narcissistic rage that had driven him for a decade finally boiled over, shattering the last remnants of his self-control. He stood up, knocking his chair over backward. I made the money, Richard screamed, his face purple, spit flying from his lips as he pointed a shaking finger at Claire. She was weak. She just wanted to sit in that stupid house and read books. I took that 50 grand and I turned it into $500 million. Me, I did the work. I stayed up all night. She didn't earn a dime of it. She deserves nothing. She is nothing. The courtroom fell dead silent. Richard stood there, chest heaving, his tailored suit rumpled, his hair disheveled. He looked wild, unhinged, and entirely pathetic. Claire Kensington finally moved. She stood up from her chair. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad. She looked at the man she had loved, supported, and rescued from the brink of ruin, and she felt absolutely nothing but a cold, liberating emptiness. I didn't want $500 million, Richard, Claire said, her voice soft but carrying perfectly through the quiet room. I just wanted my husband. But since you decided to be a CEO instead of a partner, I think it's only fair I take my initial investment back. With interest, She sat back down, folding her hands in her lap, her faded beige cardigan looking more regal in that moment than Vanessa's ruined Chanel suit ever could. Judge Carmichael picked up her gavel. The evidentiary phase of this trial is concluded. Court is in recess until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., at which time I will deliver my final ruling. Mr. Passes the mud not with some mud twizer ventisco. Hayes, I suggest you advise your client to bring a toothbrush. Given the overwhelming evidence of financial fraud, forgery, and perjury presented today, I will be forwarding these transcripts to the district attorney's office immediately upon adjourning. She struck the gavel. Court is adjourned. The morning sun sliced heavily through the high arched windows of courtroom 302, a stark and vibrant contrast to the dreary weeping rain from the day before. The mahogany benches gleamed in the natural light, but the atmosphere inside the room remained as heavy and suffocating as lead. Richard Sterling sat hunched at the petitioner's table. He looked as though he hadn't slept in a month. His usually immaculate salon-styled hair was flat and greasy, his custom-tailored suit wrinkled from nervous sweating. Gregory Hayes sat beside him, maintaining a rigid, icy professional distance. The lawyer's briefcase was already packed and snapped shut, his posture that of a man preparing for a swift, immediate, tactical retreat. Notably absent from the front row of the gallery was Vanessa Croft. Her designated seat remained empty, the ghost of her mocking cruel laughter now replaced by the grim, silent reality of impending subpoena. Across the aisle, Claire Kensington sat quietly next to Arthur Pendleton. She wore a tailored, soft gray suit, a subtle but deliberate, powerful departure from the faded beige cardigan she had worn the previous 3 days. She looked rested. She looked at peace. The nervous tremor in her hands was completely gone. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice slicing through the thick tension. Judge Mary Carmichael took her seat at the elevated bench. She did not bother with morning pleasantries. Her face was set in stone. She opened her thick leather-bound folder, adjusted her reading glasses, and looked directly down at Richard. This court has spent the entirety of yesterday evening reviewing the voluminous financial records, forensic accounting reports, and the rather illuminating testimony provided during yesterday afternoon's session. Judge Carmichael began, her voice echoing with absolute, unforgiving authority. "In my 22 years on the bench, I have rarely encountered such a blatant, malicious, and meticulously orchestrated attempt to defraud a spouse." Richard stared blankly at his hands, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table. "Mr. Sterling," the judge continued, her tone sharp enough to draw blood, "your petition for a disproportionate separation of assets is unequivocally denied. Your central claim that OmniStream Solutions is your sole separate property is not only factually incorrect, it is legally absurd. The foundational capital of $50,000 was definitively traced directly to the Kensington Family Revocable Trust under the law of this state, as that capital was separate property commingled into a business entity without a formal, legally binding buyout agreement, and given your egregious, documented breach of fiduciary duty to the marital estate, the court finds that Claire Kensington is the rightful legal owner of 60% of the equity in OmniStream Solutions." A collective jagged breath left the sparse room. Richard's head snapped up, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and filled with absolute horror. 60%. He was no longer the controlling shareholder of his own multi-million-dollar empire. He was a minority owner, legally bound to answer to the very woman he had tried to destroy. "But we are not finished," Judge Carmichael stated coldly, raising a hand to silence Richard before he could even open his mouth. "Regarding the primary marital home in Calabasas, given the irrefutable documented evidence of a forged power of attorney, this court orders the immediate sale of the property. However, the entirety of the $4.5 million debt fraudulently secured against it will be assigned solely and exclusively to you, Mr. Sterling. Ms. Kensington will receive her half of the home's unencumbered appraised value in cash, paid directly from your remaining 40% stake in OmniStream." Arthur Pendleton offered a small, highly satisfied nod, adjusting his tweed lapel. Claire maintained her quiet, composed expression, though a visible heavy weight seemed to physically lift from her shoulders. Finally, Judge Carmichael said, closing her folder with a definitive, cracking snap, "There is the matter of the $540,000 embezzled through VC public relations. I am ordering full, immediate restitution of those funds to the OmniStream corporate accounts. Furthermore, as I promised yesterday, I have forwarded the full transcripts of these proceedings along with the certified Vanguard wire transfers and offshore banking records to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office." Richard let out a choked, desperate sound resembling a drowning man. He grabbed Gregory Hayes by the arm. "Greg, do something. You have to file an appeal. You have to stop this." Hayes slowly, deliberately peeled Richard's fingers off his expensive suit jacket. "My retainer covered the divorce proceedings, Richard, which are now officially concluded. My firm does not handle criminal defense, and frankly, after the massive liability you exposed us to yesterday, I wouldn't represent you if you paid me in solid gold." Hayes picked up his briefcase, turned his back on his former client, and walked down the aisle and out the double doors without another word. "Your Honor, please," Richard begged the bench. "The company will tank if I'm not running it. You are no longer my concern, Mr. Sterling." Judge Carmichael interrupted her tone completely devoid of sympathy. "In fact, I received a phone call from the DA's white-collar crime division at 8 o'clock this morning. They have already moved to freeze your personal accounts, including the offshore holding company in the Cayman Islands, pending a criminal indictment for grand theft, forgery, and corporate fraud. I am told Miss Croft is currently cooperating fully with their investigators in exchange for leniency." Richard collapsed back into his chair, utterly defeated, the fight completely draining out of him. His mistress had turned state's evidence. His assets were frozen. His company belonged to his wife. The house of cards hadn't just collapsed. It had burst into flames, leaving him with nothing but ashes. This divorce is granted. Court is adjourned. Thus done. The gavel fell with a resounding crack, finalizing the absolute destruction of Richard Sterling. Claire stood up slowly. She picked up her modest leather handbag. She didn't gloat, nor did she spare a single backward glance at the ruined, broken man weeping quietly at the petitioner's table. "Shall we, Claire?" Arthur asked, a gentle, victorious smile touching his lips. "Yes, Arthur," Claire replied, her voice steady, clear, and ringing with newfound authority. "I believe I have an emergency board meeting to schedule." As Claire Kensington walked down the center aisle, the heavy mahogany doors swung open for her. She stepped out of the suffocating courtroom and into the bright, sunlit hallway, leaving the wreckage of her past firmly behind her, ready to take her rightful place at the head of the table. The story of Claire and Richard is a powerful, dramatic reminder that the truth always leaves a paper trail, no matter how deeply you try to bury it. Richard thought he could easily discard the woman who quietly built his foundation, blinded by his own towering arrogance and the glittering distraction of a younger mistress. He fatally mistook Claire's quiet support for weakness and her patience for ignorance. But in the end, true power doesn't need to shout from a witness stand or wear heavily funded stolen diamonds. Sometimes the most devastating checkmate comes from the exact person you underestimated the most. If you enjoyed this intense courtroom drama and loved seeing the ultimate karma unfold, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who loves a brilliant plot twist. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible, true-to-life stories of justice, revenge, and redemption. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Claire's brilliant lawyer.